Are you crazy? I promised this money to my wife, my son shouted, snatching all the savings from my hands. I had spent 40 years learning to live on little and save the rest. It wasn't much. A careful deposit each month, a coffee skipped here, a coat worn one winter longer, but it added up. By 68, I had enough for what I'd always dreamed of, a tiny house by the ocean, somewhere the wind smelled of salt and freedom, where the mornings were mine and the nights were quiet. The money sat in a heavy envelope inside my desk drawer. I checked it so often the edges of the bills were worn soft. I thought my son didn't know about it. I thought he wouldn't care. I was wrong. That night, he burst through the door without knocking. His voice carried before I even saw his face. You still have it, right? The money. Before I could ask why, he was in my living room, eyes sharp, jaw tight. His wife's perfume clung to his jacket, heavy, sweet, suffocating. I said nothing, but I must have looked guilty because he went straight to the desk. My hands shook as I stepped forward, but he was faster. He yanked the drawer open, pulled out the envelope, and ripped it from my grasp. You think this is yours? He shouted, his face inches from mine. You're crazy if you think you get to waste it on some stupid house. I promised this money to my wife. It felt like a slap, but worse, like the air itself was gone. My son, the boy I'd carried, the man I'd helped through every hardship, was looking at me as if I were an obstacle to be removed. I didn't shout back. I didn't cry. I just watched as he stormed out, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the picture frames. The silence afterward was deafening. I sat down at the desk, hands resting on the bare wood where the envelope had been. The money was gone. My dream was gone. And yet, somewhere under the grief, another feeling stirred. A strange, quiet heat. It wasn't defeat. It was the beginning. The night after he took the money, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house breathe. The groan of the beams, the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. Every sound felt too loud, every shadow too long. I replayed the moment over and over, his hand closing around the envelope, his eyes cold, his voice like a blade. By morning, the numbness had given way to something sharper. Not rage. No, rage was loud and careless. This was quieter, denser. It settled into my bones, steadying me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the steam curling against the window. Outside, the street was waking. A dog barked. A car door slammed. Neighbors waved on their way to work. Normal life moved on, as if nothing had happened. But for me, everything had shifted. I thought about all the years I had been the dependable one, the one who stayed late at work when no one else would. The one who helped with down payments, school fees, medical bills, all without asking for anything in return. I had been the scaffolding holding everyone else up. And now, when I needed my own support, it had been kicked away. It would have been easy to call a friend, to spill the whole ugly truth, and cry over the betrayal. But something in me resisted. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want to be the tragic story whispered over coffee. I wanted control. So, I began with the smallest thing. I wrote everything down. Every detail I could remember. His words, his expression. The way he didn't even hesitate before taking it. Writing it made it real. And when I read it back, it was like I was looking at evidence in a case, not just memories. That's when the idea took root. I didn't know yet how I'd do it. I didn't know how long it would take. But I knew this. I was going to get my money back. And I wasn't going to beg, threaten, or plead for it. I was going to make him hand it over himself willingly, without even realizing the trap until it closed. It wouldn't be quick. It wouldn't be clean, but it would be mine. The kettle whistled again, though I didn't remember turning it on. I poured another cup of coffee and opened my laptop. I hadn't used it much since retiring, but that morning it became a weapon. If my son thought I was old, soft, and predictable, he was about to learn how wrong he was. I started with curiosity, disguised as routine. People underestimate the power of listening, truly listening, without letting on that you are. I called my sister-in-law under the pretense of catching up. She loved to talk, and I let her. Between gossip about neighbors and complaints about rising grocery prices, she mentioned how my son and his wife were working on something big. Something big in their world usually meant something expensive. A new business, she said. A can't-miss investment his wife had found through a friend. It was the kind of vague pitch that sounded solid if you wanted to believe it, but crumbled the moment you asked for details. I didn't ask. Not yet. I just smiled into the receiver and said, "Oh, how exciting for them," and filed it away. Next came the quiet research. I went through my old address book and began making calls to people I hadn't spoken to in years. Former colleagues, a neighbor from 2 houses ago who now ran a small construction company, and even the owner of the coffee shop where my son used to hang around in his 20s, talking about big plans that never happened. Patterns emerged. My son's charm had always been his currency, but lately, people spoke of him with caution. He'd borrowed tools and never returned them, promising repayment next week that never came. Small things, but small things piled up into a picture. One afternoon, I sat at the public library, my safe place, where no one thought to look for me, scrolling through online business registries. It didn't take long to find it, a newly registered LLC, half in his name, half in someone else's. The other name caught my attention, a man I vaguely remembered. One of those smooth talkers who wore shiny shoes but couldn't keep a job for more than 6 months. The kind of man who would sell you a golden opportunity while standing on a sinking ship. I printed everything I found. Dates, names, addresses. It wasn't much yet, but it was enough to know one thing. My son and his wife weren't building a dream. They were building a trap for themselves. And I intended to make sure they fell into it. When I got home, I slid the papers into a plain manila folder. I wrote one word on the tab. Plan. I didn't know exactly what the ending would look like, but I knew the opening move. Get close enough to see their cards without showing mine. After all, I had been a mother for 38 years. I knew how to wait. I knew how to watch. And I knew exactly how to strike when a moment came. The first step toward them was a smile. I called my son one Tuesday morning, my voice warm, steady, and empty of accusation. I was thinking, I said, maybe we should spend more time together. I miss seeing you. He hesitated. I could hear the calculation in that pause before agreeing to meet for lunch. We chose a small diner halfway between our homes. He arrived late, phone in hand, barely looking at me before sliding into the booth. His eyes darted around the room as if afraid someone might overhear us. He talked about nothing at first. The weather, a funny video he'd seen, a passing mention of his wife's big plans. I let him steer the conversation, nodding in all the right places, my hands wrapped around my coffee cup as if I were simply grateful to be there. And then, as if on cue, he leaned forward. "We've got this investment," he said, lowering his voice. "High return, minimal risk. We're going to double the money in a year." I didn't ask how. I didn't challenge his claim. I just tilted my head and smiled, the way you do when you're proud of someone. That sounds impressive. He looked surprised. Maybe he'd expected me to scold him or to refuse outright. Instead, I asked him to tell me more. He did in fragments. Enough to confirm what I'd already guessed. He and his partner were putting everything into this. His money, his wife's savings, even my stolen nest egg. When the waitress came with the check, I reached for it before he could. His eyes flickered with guilt. Or was it suspicion? But he let me pay a small price for the information I was gathering. Over the next weeks, I made myself present in ways that seemed harmless. Dropping by with banana bread, asking about his wife's garden, sitting quietly in their living room while they whispered in the kitchen, thinking I couldn't hear. I learned the name of their project, the supposed suppliers, the date of their first major shipment. I also learned something more valuable. They had no backup plan. If this investment failed, they'd lose everything. One evening after a visit, I sat in my car at the end of their street, hands gripping the steering wheel. The summer sun was sinking, spilling gold over the roofs. I thought about the years I had built my life on patience, and how patience now would be my greatest weapon. They were building a house of cards. All I had to do was wait for the right gust of wind, or better yet, create it myself. I knew exactly where to start looking for it. I began with the partner, the one I'd seen on the LLC documents. He was as slippery as I remembered. He had a social media trail, and he left it messy. Photos of dinners he couldn't possibly afford, tagged in places apart on the same day. Posts about success with no proof behind them. I didn't reach out to him directly. Not yet. Instead, I made contact through someone we both knew, an old neighbor, Denise, who once worked in the same office as him. Over coffee, I let her talk, gently steering her toward the subject I wanted. "Oh, him," she said, wrinkling her nose. "Charming, but you can't trust him farther than you can throw him. He's always chasing the next big thing." Perfect. I fed her a small harmless detail that I'd heard he was working on something really important with my son, and watched her eyebrows rise. People like Denise can't keep things to themselves. Not when the information sparkles. Within days, I knew my breadcrumb had reached exactly where I wanted it to, the ears of the partner himself. Meanwhile, I kept my presence with my son steady and calm. I asked about his progress, feigned interest in the details, and even offered to help spread the word once they were ready to launch. His guard dropped little by little, as if my earlier silence about the money had been forgiveness. Behind the scenes, I studied their supplier list. I recognized one of the names, a small manufacturing company I'd once dealt with in my working years. I still had the owner's number. It took one polite phone call to arrange a catch-up meeting, and another to learn that my son and his partner had placed a dangerously large order they hadn't yet paid for in full. That was my opening. I didn't need to ruin the order. I only needed to delay it just enough to shake the trust between them and their investors. A well-timed conversation with the owner, framed as concern for his business, led him to double-check their payment before shipping. And so the days stretched into weeks without progress on their end. The partner I knew would start to panic. My son would feel the pressure from home. Their investors, whoever had been reckless enough to give them money, would begin to doubt. I wasn't rushing. I was tightening the rope one knot at a time, careful not to let them see my hands on it. In the quiet of my kitchen, sipping tea at night, I could almost hear it, the faint creak of a structure beginning to sway. They thought they'd stolen my future. I was about to show them they'd handed me the perfect present instead. It started with a phone call I wasn't meant to hear. I was at my son's house dropping off a pie I didn't bake. Store-bought, but warm enough to smell like home. His wife let me in, distracted, muttering something about work stuff before disappearing into the kitchen. I set the pie on the counter, then heard his voice from the next room. "No, that's not what we agreed on," he was saying, low and tense. "You said 2 weeks. It's been a month." Pause. Then sharper. "Don't you dare put this on me. You were supposed to handle the supplier." I took my time removing my coat, letting the words filter through the wall. I didn't catch the whole conversation, but I didn't need to. The tone told me enough. They were turning on each other. When he hung up, he came into the kitchen looking like a man trying to remember how to smile. "Hey, Mom," he said too brightly. "What's this?" He gestured at the pie. "Just a little something," I replied. My voice was soft, but my eyes lingered on his. I think he saw it, that I knew more than I was saying because he looked away first. The following week, I noticed changes. He stopped bragging about the business. His wife grew restless, her phone never leaving her hand. At lunch one afternoon, she let slip that some people were asking questions about their progress. My son shot her a warning look, but it was too late. I nodded sympathetically, hiding the flicker of satisfaction in my chest. The questions would spread. Doubt was contagious. Meanwhile, I kept in touch with the manufacturing company. The owner mentioned almost casually that my son's partner had called twice in a single day, pressing for shipment. I told him, the owner said, "Payment clears first, then we send. That's just how business works." I smiled into the phone. "Of course," I said. "You have to protect yourself." And just like that, the cracks widened. I didn't push them. Not yet. I let them push each other. Every strained glance I saw between them, every clipped exchange, was another thread loosening in the weave. One evening, as I sat on my porch, watching the light fade, I thought of the envelope that had once sat in my desk. The bills were gone, but in their place was something far more powerful. Control. I wasn't chasing them anymore. They were walking toward the edge, all on their own. All I had to do was be there when they stepped over. I knew from the start that if I wanted to take what they valued most, I had to be close enough to touch it. The problem was they still thought of me as someone on the outside, the old woman who should keep her opinions to herself. That suited me just fine. Outsiders can slip in quietly. I began by learning everything I could about their investors. A name here, a whisper there, a casual remark from my daughter-in-law about Tom and Lisa putting in a big chunk. I found Tom and Lisa easily enough, a couple from the next town over who owned a chain of small hardware stores. They were the type who liked to be seen as savvy but were too trusting for their own good. I introduced myself one afternoon at a local charity event, feigning surprise at the connection. "Oh, you're friends with my son. How funny. He never mentioned you were working together." I didn't press, just let them talk. People love to explain themselves to someone who listens. By the end of the conversation, I knew exactly how much they had invested and how nervous they were about the delays. "He says it's just a minor hiccup," Lisa told me, her smile a little too thin. I filed that away. Next, I found my way to the partner, not directly. That would spook him, but through an online business forum where he liked to boast about his projects. I asked a few leading questions under a different name, playing the role of a potential investor. His responses were sloppy, full of vague promises and contradictions. I saved screenshots of every word. It was almost too easy. When I visited my son's house again, I made sure to praise the project in front of his wife, suggesting that someone with a bit of extra experience could help smooth things over with suppliers. She laughed, a short, dismissive sound, but my son didn't. He looked at me differently that evening, as if for the first time in weeks, he saw more than just a mother bringing baked goods. That was the opening I needed. 2 days later, I sent him an email. Not emotional, not accusatory, just a short professional note offering to connect him with someone I knew who could help secure better terms with suppliers for a small percentage of the business. I made sure the percentage was low enough to tempt him, but high enough to matter later. He didn't respond immediately, but when he finally called, there was a hint of desperation in his voice. "Maybe we should talk," he said. I smiled to myself as I hung up. They'd stolen from me, thinking I'd do nothing. Now they were about to hand me the keys. We met at a small cafe far from his usual haunts. I'd chosen it deliberately, no chance of running into his wife or their business partner. The place was quiet, the kind of spot where deals could be whispered over steaming mugs without drawing attention. He looked tired. Not physically. He still had that restless energy in his shoulders. But there was something in his eyes. The shine was gone, replaced with a flicker of unease. "I've been thinking about your offer," he said, skipping the small talk. "We're hitting walls with the suppliers. If you can help, I'm open to adjustments." Adjustments? That was his way of saying he was willing to give me a stake. I leaned back, my hands folded around my cup. It would mean signing a formal agreement, I told him, my voice calm, almost disinterested. "Paperwork, signatures. My lawyer will want to review it." He hesitated, probably imagining the conversation he'd have to have with his partner, but desperation outweighs pride when the ship starts to take on water. "Fine," he said at last. Over the next week, I quietly set the terms. My supplier contact, an old friend from my working days, offered them a better deal on materials, but only if I was involved as a partial owner. It wasn't even a lie. The friend trusted me, not them. The paperwork was drawn up, neat and professional. I made sure to have every clause written to protect my interests, including the right to sell my shares without their approval. When my son signed, the sound of the pen scratching across the page felt like the first real repayment. I didn't show my satisfaction. Instead, I acted like I was doing him a favor. "This should help," I said, sliding the signed documents into my bag. "You'll see results soon." And he did. Within a month, the supplier delivered on schedule. Investors relaxed. The partners stopped making frantic phone calls. The tension in their circle eased, which was exactly what I wanted. Calm waters lull people into thinking they're safe. Behind the scenes, I was already making my next move. I reached out to 2 more investors, casually mentioning that I'd bought in. My reputation was solid. Decades in the workforce, without a single broken deal. And they took my involvement as a sign the project was worth saving. It wasn't worth saving.
Not for them anyway.
I wasn't here to keep the business afloat. I was here to make sure that when it went down, the only one left holding anything of value was me. And they had just handed me the perfect position to make that happen. Control isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about deciding when and where the silence falls. By now, I was inside their circle. My son's partner treated me with forced politeness, the way you handle someone you can't afford to offend. My son had stopped questioning my presence entirely. His wife still looked at me like I was a stray cat she hadn't decided to shoo away yet, but even she couldn't argue with the improved shipments and steadier investors. I kept my moves small. A quiet suggestion here, just a thought there. The partner wanted to expand into a second product line. I gently steered him towards suppliers I knew would delay, subtly stretching their resources thinner. My son talked about a marketing push. I encouraged it, knowing full well they didn't have the cash reserves to sustain it if things slowed. The goal wasn't sabotage they could trace back to me. The goal was to wait in the wrong places, pressing down until the cracks deepened on their own. Meanwhile, I cultivated my own exit plan. I'd had the foresight to include a buyout clause in my ownership agreement, the right to sell my shares to any interested party without needing their approval. Through a friend of a friend, I found exactly that party, a competitor who had been eyeing their investors for months. Over coffee with the competitor, I laid it out cleanly. The company was unstable, but it had assets worth buying, a brand name just starting to circulate, a supplier contract under my control. If they bought my stake, they'd inherit my influence. They didn't say yes immediately, but I could see it in their eyes. Opportunity smells different to a seasoned player. Sharp, metallic, like the scent before rain. At the same time, I began pulling back from the problem-solving role. Shipments still arrived, but a little slower. Investor updates went unanswered for days instead of hours. My son grew tense again, snapping at his wife, avoiding his partner's calls. The partner started visiting the suppliers himself, trying to push orders faster, only to find delays that seemed to sprout from nowhere. I wasn't the storm. I was the tide receding just enough to make them realize how far out they'd gone. And then one evening my phone buzzed. It was the competitor. "Let's talk numbers," the message read. I smiled, leaning back in my chair. The plan was almost complete. Soon, the business that had swallowed my savings would be out of their hands entirely. Disaster on its own. Delays happened, but the timing was perfect. It came just as they'd promised a major delivery to one of their biggest investors, and the excuse they gave sounded rehearsed. Investors noticed that kind of thing. The second crack came 2 days later when their marketing campaign hit a snag. The freelance team they'd hired walked off mid-project, claiming they hadn't been paid the full deposit. That one I'd set in motion weeks earlier by quietly planting doubts about their reliability. A contractor who doesn't trust you will find an excuse to leave. The third crack wasn't mine. It was theirs. My son and his partner had their first real public argument right there in the middle of a cafe. I wasn't there, but word traveled quickly. In small towns, business drama spreads faster than weather warnings. By the time the partner called me, he was panicked. "I don't know what's going on, but we need you to talk to the investors. They trust you." I told him I'd try, though my tone carried just enough hesitation to seed more doubt. And when I tried, I made sure the investors heard my concern, not about the project, but about the leadership. Meanwhile, the competitor I'd been courting was ready to move. We met in a quiet corner of a downtown office. Papers spread between us. They wanted my stake. I wanted my freedom and enough profit to buy back more than I'd lost. We signed that afternoon with my signature, my share, and my influence left in my son's control, landing in the hands of someone who knew exactly how to gut what was left. The shift was immediate. The competitor began contacting suppliers directly, tightening payment terms, demanding proof of solvency. Investors who had been uneasy now had someone else to rally behind, someone who wasn't my son or his partner. Within 2 weeks, the project was in freefall. The partner disappeared from town, muttering something about new opportunities. My son's wife stopped posting about their big success and started selling furniture online. And my son, he came to see me one evening, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He didn't yell this time. He didn't accuse. He just asked, "Did you do this?" I didn't answer. I only poured him a cup of coffee, set it in front of him, and let the silence do the talking. The collapse was almost complete. All that was left was the ending. My ending. The call came on a gray Thursday morning. My son's voice was flat, stripped of all the bravado I'd known since he was a teenager. "It's over," he said. "We've lost everything." I let the words hang there uncomfortably long before answering. "I'm sorry to hear that." And I was, but not in the way he thought. I wasn't sorry for the loss of his business. I was sorry for the years I'd spent believing he would treat me with the same care I'd shown him. That illusion was gone, and in its place was something far more solid. My own independence. Later that week, I closed on a small white house that faced the ocean. The paperwork was clean. The funds transferred without hesitation. Every cent came from the sale of my stake, more than double what had been taken from me. When I signed, I felt the same steady heat I'd felt the night he'd walked out with my savings. Only now it was satisfaction. I moved in quietly. No fanfare, just the sound of the waves and the scent of salt through the open windows. My days became simple: coffee on the porch, a walk along the sand, the knowledge that everything around me was mine, paid for with patience, calculation, and a refusal to be small. He came to see me once more unannounced. There was no anger left in him, only exhaustion. He stood on my porch looking past me at the ocean. "I didn't think you had it in you," he said finally. I met his eyes. "That's the problem," I replied. "You never really saw me at all." For a moment, I thought he might apologize, but instead, he just nodded as if acknowledging a truth too heavy to carry. I didn't invite him in. We stood there, the space between us wider than the years that had made it. When he left, I didn't watch him go. I turned back to my living room where the evening light poured in, soft and gold. The tide was coming in. I could hear it. They had stolen my savings, thinking I would fade into the background, that I'd settle into quiet resentment until the end of my days. Instead, I had rebuilt not just my bank account, but the way I saw myself. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't just a mother. I was the woman who had taken back everything and more without raising my voice. And as the waves rolled in, steady and endless, I realized I didn't need him to understand what I'd done. It was enough that I knew.